Okay, my name is Brian Jacobs. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. I'm the founder and CEO of panOpen, and we're the host of this webinar series. panOpen is a courseware company that provides the tools and services that faculty and academic institutions use to adopt openly licensed educational content. Um, also known as open educational resources. The combination of these tools and the openly licensed content improves equity of access by lowering costs. It also provides faculty with great control over classroom content in ways that really are only possible within an open license. It is not a question of if coronavirus becomes a worldwide pandemic, but when. That was a statement from the CDC just a year ago on this day, just a year ago today. Since then, there have been almost 30 million infections in the US, and about 500,000 people have died so far. By the spring of last year, it was already a cliche that our world had changed forever. That common practice in our messages would include phrases like, stay safe, I hope you're managing okay, strange times. To be sure, the pandemic and its related economic and political crises has at once accelerated and slowed processes that were long underway. Nowhere is this more apparent than in higher education, and especially among those institutions that serve economically disadvantaged communities and those of color. Black and brown communities have especially suffered as they are often also frontline workers and people who were already struggling before crossing this new threshold. Even one's neighborhood, it turns out, affects COVID outcomes. As sociologists from Columbia University recently showed, that racial segregation also exacerbates COVID mortality and morbidity. Higher education is usually countercyclical to unemployment and recessions. Not this time, and especially not for these communities. In this context, we've organized a webinar series, Teaching in a Time of Uncertainty, and asked faculty authors with whom we're working to address the question of what it means to teach in their discipline at this time of uncertainty. If we think about the triple crises as health, economic, and political, how do they affect the way we introduce students to a particular field of study? How does the content or content emphasis change? There is no greater social issue that we confront today than that of race relations and racial justice. And how we negotiate these issues determines how we may regard ourselves as a people, our national character. We are honored today to have Dr. Rashawn Ray lead us in these discussions. Dr. Ray is co-author of panOpen's Sociology Experiment, next generation courseware for introducing college students to the field of sociology, and written by the leading scholars in the field, such as Dr. Ray. Dr. Ray is David Rubenstein Fellow in Government Studies at the Brookings Institution, and he's a professor of sociology and executive director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research at the University of Maryland, College Park. He's also one of the co-editors of Context Magazine, Sociology for the Public. Dr. Ray's research addresses the mechanisms that manufacture and maintain racial and social inequality, with a particular emphasis on police-civilian relations and men's treatment of women. His work also speaks to the ways that inequality may be attenuated through racial uplift activism and social policy. Dr. Ray is a prolific author, and his research has been cited widely in the media, such as the Washington Post, Associated Press, Reuters, CNN, ESPN, Vox, and The Root and the Chronicle of Higher Education. Joining him is our moderator, Dr. Heather Parker, who is a member of panOpen's board of directors. Dr. Parker is Dean of the College of the Arts and Sciences and Professor of History at St. Leo University. She earned her PhD in history from UCLA, where she began her academic career examining interethnic political interaction in the mid-20th century Los Angeles. While she has devoted much of her recent career to administration, she continues to engage in research and is now focused on interethnic religious interaction and the political implications of these relationships in Florida. So with that, I'd like to turn it now over to Rashawn and Heather in our discussion of teaching race relations, racial justice in a time of uncertainty. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to add my welcome to Brian's. We are pleased to have you join us today. We are going to have Dr. Ray talk to us for a little while about what Brian has already discussed with you, after which you will be encouraged to enter your comments and your questions in the Q&A section. When Dr. Ray is finished, I will lead him through your questions and he can provide answers for you. When this session is over, if your answer has not been addressed, if your question has not been addressed, should I say, you will have an opportunity to email Dr. Ray with your questions. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Ray. Thank you.
Dean Parker, thank you for having me on. I really look forward to our conversation. To Dr. Jacobs and the panOpen team who have just done a great job putting this together. I am honored to be a part of this event, as well as be a part of a sociology experiment, which is led by the co-author from my chapter, Pat Sharkey, and also Seamus Khan, who really wanted to figure out a better way to disseminate content to instructors, professors, and as well as students at a lower cost. And I think panOpen really delivers on that. What I'm going to do over the next 15 minutes is give essentially an overview of the chapter that Pat and I wrote, in particular thinking about all of the multiple pandemics and endemics that Dr. Jacobs highlighted at the beginning. And of course, race becomes one of the main ways that we think about it. So I'm going to really be discussing how we might think about interpersonal racism and also institutional or structural or systemic racism, and how that plays a role in how we might enter it into the classroom, regardless of the courses that we might be teaching. Now, of course, when we talk about implicit and explicit bias, implicit bias is simply the association our minds make between two seemingly unrelated things, like, say, crime and a person's race, or housework and a person's gender, that then plays a role in how we think about those people because we are associating them with groups. The one big thing to realize about bias, and I tell my students this in the first couple of weeks when I teach sociological social psychology to a large group of undergraduates at the University of Maryland. This class has kind of a max occupancy of about 180, and oftentimes we reach that or really get close to that, is I talk to them about how bias and stereotypes, interpersonal racism or sexism are all about groups. And that's because we don't have enough information about the individual to make an assessment. Therefore, we associate them with a group. Explicit bias, on the other hand, is overt prejudice attitudes that we are oftentimes aware of, that we are conscious about. And so the part of the interesting thing about the relationship between implicit and explicit bias, because there is a correlation there, it's not as strong as people might think. Think about explicit bias or explicit attitudes. That's the tip of the iceberg. Think about implicit bias, our unconscious or subconscious thoughts, as being the entire iceberg that is underneath the water, what we can't see, but matters so much and really impacts our daily decision-making, our physiological responses, and then obviously what we think and feel about other people. When we talk about bias, of course, we're really talking about stereotypes in many regards. Stereotypes are widely shared perceptions about the personal characteristics, tendencies, and abilities of individual members of a particular group. Again, that group is the significant part. And oftentimes when we talk about stereotypes, there are four main categories we can put them in. Typically, people are talking about a person's intellectual ability, their physicality, their emotional responses, and their propensity to commit crime. Typically, stereotypes fall into those four categories. I always tell students, identify the source of the stereotype. Which category can we put it in? Is it about how smart a person is or not? Is it about how criminally prone they might be? Is it about their ability or inability to control their emotions? Dr. Stephen Foy and I wrote an article that was published in the American Journal of Sociology. And what we did was we examined the role that skin tone played in the way that commentators describe basketball players. We can think about that in the context of coming up to March Madness, a very different March Madness than we potentially ever had. But one thing we know is that what commentators say stem from oftentimes their implicit or explicit bias about the players. They are more likely to talk about darker skinned players as being more physically oriented, being stronger, being taller, being faster, despite the fact that lighter skinned players are actually taller and way more than the darker skinned players. On the other hand, they talk about the lighter skinned players as being clever, being crafty, being hardworking. I mean, look, these latch on to corollaries that have existed in the United States and elsewhere for centuries, which suggest that Black people are physically superior yet intellectually inferior. And then the corollary for whites, which is that they are intellectually superior and physically inferior, when we have tons of examples to counter that point. These prejudices then become about beliefs and attitudes that impact what happens. But we know that's just a one way in which racism exists. Oftentimes, the way that we overemphasize, because it's difficult for us to see the way that racism operates in institutions. The way that systemic racism operates in institutions ends up impacting our policies, our rules, our regulations, and our laws that govern us, where racism is oftentimes embedded within them to govern where we live, where we eat, where we shop, where we go to school, where we socialize. And then, of course, the way we are penalized or privileged based on where we are situated in these social institutions. When we talk about racism in public, we could consider incidents where racist behavior or attitudes can become public, either intentionally or unintentionally. And some questions that oftentimes I pose to students, like when I teach, why are we still talking about race? I remember when I developed that course at Maryland, we call it an I-series course, an innovative course, where we're supposed to put students through a host of interesting things out in their social worlds in the county or the state in which they're in. And I remember when we developed that course, why are we still talking about race? It was an interesting question at the time. President Obama was president. A lot of people were really embracing color blindness. And then Trump was elected and all sorts of stuff happened. Charlottesville happened and Black Lives Matter really started to blossom. And now, of course, I don't think anybody is asking that particular question, but these are some questions that a lot of students have. Like when I taught at Indiana, these are some of the things that they thought about. How much should we care about racism? If it is privately expressed, should it be a public concern? Well, I can tell you, studying law enforcement, yes, it should be. Because if law enforcement holds anti-Black bias, which more of them do than we might want, that spills over into their treatment of people. There's no bigger evidence of that than what happened with the Capitol insurgency, where about 1 out of 5 of the people who have been identified and been arrested have law enforcement and military roots. And we can also think about, to what extent do the thoughts or sentiments of private individuals relate to institutional racism? Well, they are highly linked. And these are questions that, regardless of the course you're teaching, that students have questions about. We know that when we look at, say, the Black Lives Matter movement, that we can look at going from, say, 2017 up through almost the present, the amount of support that has grown. A lot of that I know from the work I've done with a large data set using Twitter is that Black Lives Matter was very deliberate about how that hashtag was used. And the more evidence people see as we kind of get out of our echo chambers, that Black Lives Matter has become a hashtag that a lot of people use. And when it pops up, not only does it show Black people being treated unfairly, being discriminated against, at times, unfortunately, being killed by law enforcement, having the police called on them for normal activities, but it also shows how white people engage in the same behaviors get treated drastically different. People can no longer deny that. So some of the questions that we might think about is, will the movement against racial injustice lead to meaningful change? When I teach race relations, this is the key question that about 2/3 of the way through class, students say, are we ever going to be able to make progress? And interestingly, students pushed me to think more about policy, to think more about social activism and social change, to be able to provide them with examples. Oftentimes examples that empirical research has not caught up with yet, but the platform that panOpen has allows for us to have the opportunity to bring things into class that we otherwise might not be able to. So how do we think about this? What steps would be required to reduce racial inequality? What can be done to end institutional racism? Is this moment going to lead to meaningful change? I teach an honors course in our social justice and the law sequence at the University of Maryland through our Maryland Law Program. These are about 70 students, 70 to 80 students who are, just top notch. They're in the honors program. And we talk about social justice. We talk about social justice theories and frameworks and how we might think about institutional and policy change. These are some of the questions that students want to know about. They want to have examples about what's going on. And some of the things that I do in class as we get ready to close and have this conversation, and I hope you all have a lot of questions, because what I want to leave you all with at this point are some of the strategies I use. Look, teaching race is difficult. I think teaching is difficult, period. Particularly in an era where we're competing with technology and devices, and you might say something or do something and someone records you or says something. One big lesson I always learned is don't say anything or do anything that I wouldn't want my grandmother to see or hear. That helps me in the classroom and outside of the classroom. But part of what panOpen does with their platform is helps us to put things on a student's level. When I teach race, sometimes I teach a 200 level class. Other times I teach a smaller 400 level class. Well, their knowledge and the content that I want to provide, even though I want to talk about similar topics, are different. For the 400 level class, I want to layer them up with terms and concepts and definitions. So I'm able to go in panOpen and say, even manipulate my own chapter. And I can change the language. I can add in new things while still keeping the framework of what I've already written. You all can do that as well. It can also be timely. It can also be timely and flexible. And part of what I mean by that is I'm able to go in, say something happened yesterday, or even right before class, because geez, the world we're living in, something happens every 5 minutes. And because of social media, we know about it quicker. And I know that students are going to talk about it. It allows me to instantly go in, edit my content, and then to also assess how students are receiving the information in a lot of different ways, not just with multiple choice tests, even in a large class, but by hearing their responses. And then it allows for me to integrate the panOpen platform with the platform that I use at the University of Maryland, which is Canvas or Elms or one of these sort of platforms. So it allows for a lot of different strategies. One big thing that I do when I come into class every day is I have an in the news section. In the news and what sociological theory has to say about it. I love these 5 or 10 minutes at the beginning of the class. I come in with 2 or 3 things. Normally, these are things that students have emailed me about. Dr. Ray, what do you think about this? Or Dr. Ray, you were talking about basketball the other day and I was watching a game and you know what? I heard a commentator make this statement. So now I bring that into class and say, in the news, what sociological theory has to say about it? I play a short clip. I put up a media headline, and then I ask the students, based on what you've learned over the past couple of weeks, which theory helps to explain what we're seeing? So as part of thinking of new ways to do this, the final thing I'll say on this point is I always think about class. Sorry for all these basketball analogies. I honestly don't know where they're coming from today, but we always have another game to play. We always have another free throw to shoot. So when I'm in class and a student asks me a really, really good question, it's kind of like the good questions that my 9 and 10-year-olds ask me. Like they ask really good questions where I'm like, that was a good question. I don't know. I need to kind of do some research and think about that. You always have another class to do that. And it's perfectly okay to tell students, look, we have content to cover, but next class, we're going to start class and I'm going to answer that question. They respect that. They like that. It doesn't mean you're on the fly. And then you want to go to an outlet like panOpen where you can gather a whole bunch of different resources, put it together quickly, and then come in class being prepared. So I really look forward to the Q&A and look forward to the conversation with Dean Parker.
All right, we'd like to open up now. You can go ahead and type your questions or comments into the Q&A, and we'll get the conversation going here. Dr. Ray, our first question comment says, since our cultural wars are so closely aligned with political preferences and labels, how do we bring excellent examples, contemporary of racism, like the Capitol riot, into the classroom without having the students think that the commentary is partisan?
I love this question. Look, being a Black professor, one of the things that happens is that people automatically assume that I'm extremely liberal or extremely progressive, which might be true in some regards. But in the classroom, that's not my job. My job is to give them information and content on how to discern what they're hearing, reading, and seeing. I tell them that. I aim to be neutral and objective. I also aim to play devil's advocate. Let me give you a couple of specific strategies that I do on this topic. One of the biggest things that I do is there is a media bias chart that I use that I bring into class. You can look it up, media bias chart, been super examined, but I tell students, I'm like, look at this chart. Think about where you're getting information from. The other thing I do is I rely on information from say James Moody, who's at Duke, who has this fascinating graphic of Senate votes over time, starting in like the 1970s. And what it shows is that political polarization started long before social media, started long before former President Obama, and was actually under former President Bill Clinton. And so part of documenting that rise with Bush 1 going to Clinton and Bush 2 is that you're able to show how Senate votes split and how media started responding to that. The other thing I do is I bring in objective information about who watches which type of news. I show them that up until, say, last month, Fox News dominated the past decade, dominated it. And I let my students know, I'm like, look, regardless of what you think, if you are not watching multiple cable news channels from Fox to MSNBC to CNN, then you are missing a part of what people think. And that means you have a gap in your learning and your understanding. So I try to approach it that way. The final strategy that I'll say, and I'm really good at this. This is the reason why I have students at the beginning of class. Let me tell you two things I do, particularly with large classes, but I do them in small classes too. So in small classes, 30 or under, you're going to pretty much know your students pretty early on. When I'm teaching 120, 180 students, I see students around campus and I don't even know they're in my class. Like it's sad to say, but it's just so many of them in this, this kind of movie theater like room that I teach in that I just don't know them. But let me tell you how I get to know them. First week of class, their first assignment is to tell me information about them. Tell me where they're from. Tell me what, information that I can't get from the list, like their year and all that kind of stuff. Tell me where they're from. Tell me their favorite food. Tell me their favorite movie. Tell me their favorite musician or musical group. And then I bring that into class. I have kind of a list. And if it's things that I don't know, I at least watch a clip, I get familiar about it, and I bring it into class as a way to integrate the students in the class. The final thing I do is I have them write what I call reflection statements on the reading or something we discussed in class. I have them do 10 a semester. These are really graded for participation, even though students don't exactly know that. So they take them really, really seriously until about they're like at 5 or 6 and they're like, I think he's just seeing if we did it. I do read them, but with 120 or 180 students, I can't go through line by line and grade them. But what I do is I figure out who's been reading. I figure out who knows the content. And when we're in class, I sit in class and I say, what do you all think about this? Heather, tell me. And Heather's sitting there like, this Heather or that? Yes. Heather Parker, what do you think? And then Heather Parker's like, how do you know my name? It's because I read that reflection statement and know that she has read the material. And I allow students to say what I really want them to hear. And then I double down on that point. Another big strategy that I do is when someone says something I agree with, I nod my head. When someone says something I don't agree with, I stop nodding. It's an implicit thing, but students really pick up on it.
So we have a couple of questions, both on the subject of online teaching. And so I'm going to sort of meld those together and you can answer them both. So the one question is, teaching primarily online, what are some suggestions for addressing issues of race in discussion posts, et cetera, to maintain civility? And the similar question has to do with being a white woman teaching about race online. and what strategies can she use in her online classes to connect with her African American male students without being patronizing?
Yeah, great questions. So on the first front, structure. I'm all about structure. For students who take my class, they'll tell you that my classes seem like at times that it's just a lot of things going on and it seems like I'm just doing things on the fly. No, that's definitely not the case. My courses are highly structured and I treat them like extended infomercials. So if I'm teaching twice a week, 75 minutes, I treat them like 15-minute segments. Every 15 minutes, I transition. It's subtle, but it happens. I transition from a discussion to a lecture. I transition from a lecture to a short video. I transition from a short video to small groups discussion. And so I'm doing that purposefully because I know the way that people's attention spans operate. So in the online environment, particularly with Zoom, I've gotten really good at using breakout sessions. Now, that doesn't mean I don't mess up the technology. Who cares? The students get a laugh out of that. I'm like sitting up for 3 minutes trying to figure out how to put people into groups. But I sort people into small groups and then I have people report out the same information. This isn't about how you feel. This isn't even exactly what you think. This is how what we just watched or what you just heard relates to what we read. So I'm very, very deliberate about what's going on. And I make specific statements like on page 3 of the text, we read da 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 da. So I'm very deliberate about that. So I think structure is very, very key. And then what happens after that structure is you bring groups back together and you call on the different groups number. Group 6, how did you all respond to this question? They do a report out. I'm also deliberate the more I get to know students about balancing their skill sets, balancing who pays attention and who doesn't. And I tell students that throughout the semester, everyone needs to make sure they speak at least once. It doesn't have to be the first 4 weeks. You don't have to speak every week, but it needs to rotate with how we think about these groups. So the person reporting out is not reporting about what they think. They're reporting about what the group thinks, and that helps them to feel more comfortable. In terms of being a white woman talking about race, I tend to think that oftentimes being white becomes one of the best ways to address this issue. It's similar to how I think about approaching gender. Oftentimes, some of the most powerful commentary and the way that I can use the privilege that I have when it comes to maleness is to actually talk about the prominence of gender discrimination, to talk about the prominence of sexual assault, to talk about the prominence of the second shift. I understand that I have that. And I think white people have to think about leveraging that a bit more. Now, what are some of the ways you go about doing it? Well, again, it's in the structure and it's about how you set it up. I'll give you one really good one that I actually reverse, and it'll make sense in a second. See, when I stand in front of the classroom, or when Dean Parker stands in front of the classroom, they see Black people. And oftentimes some students, based on their own implicit bias, will impact how they are receiving information from us, particularly when race and gender intersects. And there's a lot of evidence on that and the difficulty of women of color being in the classroom relative to men and relative to white women. So part of leveraging that is this. Pretty much every author that I bring in, every researcher that I discuss, I show a picture of them. Oftentimes, particularly historically, that's going to be white men. So here goes this juxtaposition for me, talking about race, and then I put up Robert Park. I put up Herbert Bloomer. I put up some of these other people. And now all of a sudden it's a mismatch, right, between what's going on. I show a clip from Jane Elliott. And so now all of a sudden they're seeing that. I think for white people, you have to make sure, and then of course I bring in a lot of minority voices as well, Black, Latinx, Asian images of authors deliberately. So as white people, look at your syllabus and say, how diverse are the authors on my syllabi? And then you can put up images of them. Authors. Oh, this week we read text from 3 scholars. You put their pictures up. It's women, it's members of racial minority groups. And all of a sudden, it starts to implicitly impact students. I think the final thing is understand that trust has to be earned over time. In the classroom, similar to working with law enforcement, I never go into it aiming for them to trust me. What I understand is that respect is a pathway to the trust. So if I gain their respect, hopefully by the end, they end up trusting the content and trusting what I'm saying. But oftentimes we try to gain the trust fast. And we have to understand that there's baggage that students bring to class based on their own experiences in life that prevent them from trusting people, particularly people who are professors in the role we're in, regardless of our racial or gender background. So get the respect where you just come in and do what you do, and eventually it starts to wane, and you use different strategies by which to deal with that.
Thank you. We have another question here and part of a comment as well. Should a distinction be made between such things as implicit bias, attitudes, preconceptions, and actual behavior, in that there is not always a direct causal relationship? A person may have any of the aforementioned and yet not behave or allow themselves to behave in that way.
Yeah, good question. Of course. And this is the reason why I made it a point to say that oftentimes our implicit biases relate to our behavior. Part of the key part of that sentence was oftentimes, not all the time, not always. But one thing that I know from our virtual reality lab with law enforcement is that when people are stressed, when people are tired, when people don't have the most information they need, and this is where it gets fun for me as a social psychologist, where I'm able to bring in terms like subjective uncertainty, cognitive dissonance, ultimate attribution error. Again, this is the details where you get into with the terms, and you're able to highlight that when you put those things together, stress, lack of information, lack of sleep, people having to rush to make decisions, it leads to steroids being on bias. I mean, at least leads to bias being on steroids. So part of highlighting that is there is a lot of empirical evidence showing a connection between attitudes and behaviors, even though we haven't seen the type of research that oftentimes when we get into the nitty gritty that we want to see. This is one of the things we're doing at the Lab for Applied Social Science Research that I can say we do with law enforcement, where we show a connection between their attitudes and their behaviors. The other parts that's left out here is the importance of physiology. There's an important study by Trewalter and her colleagues. Trewalter is a professor at Virginia Tech. See, this would be an example. I put her up. She's a white woman. Put her up and I say, she found that I'll briefly talk about how I come in and do one of my prejudice lectures, because I spend a couple of lectures on this. I come in class, and depending on how I'm feeling that day, I might even have a toy snake and a spider. All right, and I have them sitting on the desk, and I come in and I throw them like kind of toward the students' way. They freak out, right? They're like, "Oh my gosh, that's crazy." They have this physiological reaction to that. And I say, think about that. Now, other times I might just show a picture of a snake or a spider. People still freak out similarly. And I say, you just had a physiological reaction to that. Well, Trewalter's research shows that the same physiological reaction that some people have to snakes and spiders, they have to Black men in close places like an elevator. Imagine giving those people a gun. That's the reason why Black people are 3.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by police when they're not attacking or have a weapon. So I'm able to make that link. And then, of course, I'm able to do other cool things with the virtual reality lab that I have around law enforcement. But that's just one issue. I mean, there are everyday mundane things that happen about who's considered smart in class or not. Well, that directly impacts who they're going to choose. And there's tons of empirical research highlighting the ways that implicit bias relates to behavior, particularly in, say, hiring of women and people of color in terms of pay. So it's tons of research out there that people are able to find to make that connection. And it's really important to do that.
Okay, so we have a question about the difficulty of teaching social problems and the heaviness of that course material for students, a whole semester of discussing widespread harm. And I think we all deal with that. How might you integrate good news, successful problem mitigation, like the Denver approach to sending teams to deal with mental health crises instead of the police, for example, while still keeping the focus on what we need to learn in classes like social problems?
Really, really great question. This gets back to what I was saying earlier when I realized that throughout a semester, talking about race relations in a period where students are inundated with images, particularly during a time period where students with the current generation, including younger millennials, Generation Z, and whatever the new generation we're calling them, is that they've been brought up in color blindness to think that if you work hard, you're going to be treated equally because they came up under President Obama. I mean, like if we have a sophomore right now, I mean, we go back, I mean, what? They were 7 when President Obama was elected, 6 or 7. So in that regard, they've grown up with that. And then all of a sudden, over the past 4 or 5 years, things shifted for them. And that's been difficult for them to handle. So what are some of the ways that I try to bring in good news? Well, let me tell you, every class, I end with an upbeat thing of how it's addressed. So if I'm talking about education inequality, and I'm talking about how, look, Brown versus Board of Education, or, desegregation doesn't really operate in the same way. And because of, some of the Supreme Court decisions that we have de facto segregation again, students are just very downtrodden about that. Well, I do a couple things. First, I highlight legislation at the congressional or state level that is aiming to combat that. Now, that's easy for me because I'm in the policy space. But for people who aren't, it's actually not that difficult. You can go to Congress and search a bill. You can go to the state you're in and search a bill and say, this is how people are trying to address this problem. So if that's something you want to do, well, then write your representative, call their office. That I give them tools to do that. The other thing I do is when I'm talking about stereotypes, I bring in people that counter the stereotypes. For example, when I'm talking about these corollaries, physical superiority and intellectual superiority, I talk about a young man whose name is Cameron from Philly, who made a perfect score on the SAT. He's Black. I talk about Lamert, who is on the physical side, who's a French sprinter who's beat Usain Bolt 3 times. Like, people just can't believe it. Like, students are looking it up on their phones. They're like, it's no way this white Frenchman beat Usain Bolt. And I'm like, yeah, because we overemphasize these things, not realizing that they're not really baked in empirical research. So I bring in positive examples throughout, and I'm very deliberate about the images I show. I spend a lot of time on that. I don't just put up words. They can read the words in the book. They should have read that. Images and videos that not just show the deleterious outcomes, but also show some ways that they can actually become the change that they want to see.
Okay, so we have a question here about how to bring in applied measures. So we teach the students to think. How do we get them to apply what they have learned? And this example here is about the technology involved with making social media possible, but there being a lag in regulations indicating what should or should not be allowed. And that's something that students can work on in an applied fashion about what that means. And do you have any other ideas?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'll tell you the couple things that I do. It depends on the course that I'm teaching, but typically every course I have some type of applied component. Now, this applied component varies greatly by the skill set of the class. And what I mean by that is oftentimes whether or not it's a intro level course or a 400 level course where these students are getting ready to graduate or getting ready to go to grad school or something. But I have an applied component. Typically looks like 2 ways for me. First is we have a semester project. Might include interviewing people in the community about a specific topic, whatever we're focused on for that course. So one of my race courses, we have like a it's a thematic course where depending on the semester and what's going on in life, we hone in. So we focus on policing, or we focus on healthcare, we focus on education or the wealth gap or something. They go out and interview people. They construct the interview guide, they're applying it. As a matter of fact, I'm gonna give you all 2 more models. So there's one model. They have to put a poster together, they have to present it. I invite other faculty, I invite other students, I figure it out how they can put their posters up in the building, just a host of things to be able to showcase the work they've done. Second thing I do is, particularly if it has a social justice element or you want to bring that in, is have students take a social problem. Here goes a social problem. You've learned all this information. How would you solve it? Now what I want you to do is try to get your information to unelected official. It can be at the local level, the state level, or the federal level. But try to do that. And then I have them incorporate that process into their final paper. The final thing that I'll say is, at the end of my social psychology class, I give students 4 things that they can respond to. These are like 4 paragraph prompts that have a few sentences and then a question, a big question. And I have them write about how they respond to it. One of those deals with social media and memes. And I teach them how to do an assessment of, say, content, to essentially perform a content analysis. And they have to go throughout that process. So I give them projects that allow them to apply what they're learning. I don't always critique them or grade them for their methodological expertise, particularly if they're not sociology majors and they haven't had, say, the research methods course, or they're not majoring in social science. But it's more about the idea and the follow through and the content. I give them a lot of guidance. The other thing I say, that if you're at a university or in an area that has grad students, and I say area because you could be at a community college or you could be at a liberal arts school and you might not have a lot of grad students, but have one nearby. I invite those grad students in to present their research. The grad students love that opportunity, and students get to see people who they perceive to be closer to their age instead of someone who, I hope I still look young, but like I'm old enough to be their daddy. So it creates a disconnect, but them seeing someone who's only a few years older than them, they're like, oh yeah, maybe I could do that. And I'll tell you, that happened in my social psychology class 4 years ago. And now the best undergrad student I've ever had, who originally wanted to go to law school, is now planning to get her PhD in sociology. And it's because she said she really started paying attention to the class when I brought grad students in who were younger talking about their work.
That's a good lead into another comment question we have here from a professor who teaches sociology, and says, obviously this is an excellent segue. If you're teaching sociology, you talk about these issues that people are concerned with right now. But she has a hard time getting students to know what sociology is and to become excited about taking sociology classes. So how do we promote sociology as a major and as a discipline to students who come out of high school having never taken a sociology class and don't know what it is?
Great question. I love this question. I used to ponder this question too, when not only students would ask me, but my own family and friends, like, what the heck do you do? And the fact that I would mull over the answer, I was like, okay, clearly we're not good at messaging, and we're not. So what I've aimed to do, I'll give you a couple things. First big thing is, this is what I say. Sociology is the study of the relationship between how people think what they think, feel what they feel, and do what they do, to the broader social institutions that we live within: education, our neighborhoods, our family, media, the criminal justice system, the economy. That's how I define it for people. From there, what I do is, if it's what does sociology look like? The grad students help. Also, talking about my own research helps, which was something that took me a long time to do, because as everyone on here knows, look, I mean, we're just kind of, well, not all of us, but a lot of us are kind of self-deprecating. Like, I'm not coming to class to talk about my research and my work. I'm coming to teach the content, and the content isn't about me. It's about these concepts. Oftentimes people who have been studying this stuff for decades. But students started saying, like, they would read something about me or see me doing something. They would say, hey, why don't you ever talk about that? That's cool. And I'm like, well, that's not my job right now to talk about that. My job is to teach you all this. And they said, yeah, but it helps to personalize it. It helps us to know what you're doing. So I would do that periodically. I don't do it often, but when I say that a couple of times a semester, I'll say, you know what, this topic is actually related directly to what I do. So literally I present to them as I would giving a talk. And they really, really appreciate it, because they don't really get that. They get lectures. They don't really get research talks. The other thing that I'll say is, I will take the opportunity, and part of showing them the pictures of people really help, to say, oh, this is so-and-so, like I know in particular, when I do education, this is Prudence Carter. She is the dean at UC Berkeley. She used to be at Stanford and Harvard, and she studied all this stuff from the United States to Africa, right? So I highlight these people. Then here goes the main thing you have to do. You have to show them what they can do with their degree. So what I tell them is, I'm like, look, you're going to gain a research skill set. You're going to learn how to do some basic statistics. You're going to learn how to do some cross tabs, put some descriptive tables together. You're going to learn how to think about different methodologies, qualitative inquiry, how to do interviews, what ethnography is. And you know what? This is going to be helpful at every place, from the census to a nonprofit to going into another field. And at your university, and I do this nationwide and at the University of Maryland, where I say, with the sociology degree, look at the likelihood of you getting a job. That's what they want to know. Like the reason why they don't major in sociology and they major in business is because they think they can get a job easier. Well, you show them that's not always the case because of the skill set you have. I also kind of have some of these career days. I'll bring in people who are in their 20s, 30s, and 40s to kind of have a career day. And it's interesting because it's even easier now that we're using technology, right? So I don't have to worry about having the person leave work and come. I can do it where they stay in their office and I put them up virtually and they're able to talk about, oh yeah, I'm at the census today, or I'm working at this nonprofit and we're working on this new voting project. Like things for students to grab a hold to and see what it means to be a sociologist with a sociology degree. And I think those are the kind of things that help. Like when people think of the economy or they think of a psychologist, they kind of get that. But a sociologist is like, what do they do? I help them to fill that gap.
Good. So here's I think, a very important question about color blindness, the term color blindness. What do we do with that term today? That's still out there everywhere. So the question is, do you think color blindness is a misused term? Does it make one blind to the inequalities and disparities that plague Black and brown peoples?
Yeah, does it make people blind to? Yes. So it does make people blind to the disparities. But part of the way that I use color blindness is I oftentimes automatically assume that most of my students embrace color blindness. Now, like in the fall, after all the stuff that's happened over the past year, I think there will be a shift in students' knowledge base. But I'll say this, after getting my PhD in Indiana, depending on where you are in the country will dictate that. I mean, if you're in Florida, compared to being in Maryland, where we're close to DC, like everything that happens in DC is local news. If you're in Indiana or Minnesota or Arizona, it's not local news. So your level of consciousness about what's happening politically isn't the same as, say, living here. The other thing I realize is a basic question that I always ask. So when I was in undergrad in Memphis, the question was, how does race matter? Like, look, Memphis is highly segregated. People knew that racism was a thing. They knew that Black people were on the side of the city. They knew MLK died there, but they still didn't exactly figure out how it was working. They know what it is. They know why it's happening. They're like, yeah, because I'm Black. Because I'm Black and I'm from Memphis. It's not just because I'm poor, because we might not be poor. In Indiana, though, the question was, what is racism? Very, very different fundamental question that I used as a guide. In Maryland, the question is, why does race matter? Because the area around DC is one of the most diverse areas in the country, where you walk down the street and people are speaking so many different languages that people are like, well, yeah, of course, people have different cultures and ethnicities, but that doesn't mean people are treated differently because of it, right? We see tons of successful Black people and Latinx folks. So that core question becomes important for how we're thinking about it. And really part of thinking through this is what I do with color blindness is I put it in a continuum of attitudinal theories about race. So I talk about explicit racism of the past that, of course, is still around. I mean, we saw that with the Capitol. But I put that in a particular socio-historical context. I talk about the racial awakening of kind of, Reconstruction and civil rights, and now currently with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I talk about color blindness and why people think that's the case. I also show video clips. I rely a lot on videos, short videos. And when I say short, I mean like 2 to 5 minutes that just give them a highlight and then I fill it in to really highlight some of this stuff. And I know with panOpen, these are things you can bring in and incorporate and find really good resources, like shorter things that help you to make a point. But I put color blindness in a continuum of theoretical frameworks about how people think about race. And the other thing I do is I let students off the hook for being colorblind. I don't assume that they know anything else. And interestingly, it's important to note, I also don't assume that minority students aren't also colorblind, because you can have a lot of minority students who come from affluent backgrounds and they've lived in a bubble and they're like, people don't still do stuff like that. It's like, yeah, sure they do. So part of it, and that also comes from, I have a series of tools in my in my teaching toolkit, if you will, that based on the information I get from students in the first few weeks of the class dictates how I pull it out and when I pull it out. And reading what they write helps me to be able to prepare best for some of these things.
Okay, so here's another question, comment. Someone is talking about teaching in the classroom and made this statement that the election was stolen. Trump said that the election was stolen, and also encouraged violence that resulted in the riots at the Capitol. So he made this statement to his class. He then received an email from a student who dropped the class saying that he was indoctrinating the students and talking politics. And so he responded by saying that he was noting the facts, not opinion, that the purpose of college and sociology was to help them understand what's occurring in society by applying relevant concepts to current issues. So how do we deal with students who believe that when we're saying facts of something that happened, that we're spinning those into our own personal opinions? I know you already addressed that a little bit, but.
Yeah. So I assume that this person is saying that they were saying that this is what Trump said, right? So
we're just repeating what Trump said and then
just repeating what Trump said. And then a student got mad that like assumed that the professor was saying, well, you know, that Trump was lying or telling the truth either way. So, okay. So how would I address that? So it's a couple ways. And I've had this directly happen. So when I was teaching race in 2016, when Trump won the election, I had a test scheduled the next day. I didn't even realize it. I just kind of had scheduled the thing, and presidential elections have been relevant before, but never as relevant as we've seen the last two in this social movement we're in. So I had to delay the exam. But part of what happened is I remember a month before there were a series of students who were mostly white men who were wearing "Make America Great Again" hats to class. And this was even like a little before "Make America Great" became so polarizing, but it was getting that way. And I remember during class that a group of the MAGA students got up and left class. Okay, it's a large class, so I didn't chase them or anything. But what I did do is I sent them an email and I said, hey, listen, I said, I hope that you realize that it's important for you to be in this class. It's important for your perspectives to be heard. And it's important for me to disseminate objective information. I said, I hope you'll come back to class. I said, I hope that you'll engage with students. I said, if you want to meet with me, let me know. And a couple of them took me up on that. And we had some great conversations. The other thing about that is, how do I address it in the classroom on the spot? Well, sometimes I don't. I address it the next class. Now, if it's super disruptive, of course, I'm like, look, we're going to be respectful. We're not going to disrespect anyone in here. We can agree to disagree. And I lay those ground rules throughout. But one of the things that I probably would have done was played, like this would have been an example of where I did in the news. In the news, what does sociological theory have to say? Come in, I show a media clip. Trump saying that the election was stolen. Somebody else saying that things were fair. And then I say, look, I'm not in here to debate whether it was stolen or not. What we know is that according to the record, Joe Biden is going to be the next president and Trump is going to be out of the White House. That's not what we're here to debate. We're here to say, based on what you've learned in this class, what does sociological theory tell you about this? Now, mind you, if it's far along in the semester, which November would have been, I have enough knowledge about the students, and now I'm calling on them specifically. Brian, what do you think? I already know what Brian's going to say because he told me last week. But he says something exactly what I want him to say, and I nod. I call on somebody. Oh, here goes another cool trick too. When you say, who wants to speak? 5 students raise their hand. I count them based on who I want to have the last word. And I literally order them in that way. So again, these are very strategic things that nobody really sees. It takes time to practice them. But now all of a sudden, it's not me saying that Trump stole the election or that he got the election stolen. We heard that directly on the video. And then we heard the counterpoint to balance it. Now let's have a discussion, not about whether or not it was stolen, but what does sociology have to say? And I keep them on that track. And normally we get to a good solution.
Okay, we have time for one last quick answer to a question here.
Okay.
So this question asks your thoughts on having people post anonymously in discussion forums for online courses, and sort of seeing if you expose stereotypes, because if people post with their names, often there's stereotypes associated with certain people's names. So is posting anonymously a way to get information without having to worry about that kind of bias?
Yes, I think so. So let me tell you how I do it. And in the online format, I mean, you have to figure it out, but I think it'll be kind of easy, just a little bit more work. I actually have students to provide, I can see them, but to other students, they're blind. And that becomes important. I'm like, look, I have to see it to kind of grade your participation, but we're going to post what you have to say. One good way to do that, I use these online tools where they do surveys in class. So I know if they participated, but I don't know what answer they associated with that. I just know whether or not they participated. That actually helps students participate more. So figuring out, I think those strategies become really, really important for doing some of these things.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, for your questions. Thank you, Dr. Ray, for a very, very inspiring and interesting presentation. There's lots of comments saying how everyone really appreciated your candor and your enthusiasm and the way you treated the subject matter. For those of you who submitted questions and we weren't able to get to them, we will respond to those. If you send an email to us at support@panOpen, you can see here on this slide, the email is there for you. Please feel free to send your emails to that email address. Also, those of you who submitted questions about using the panOpen platform, that is where you send those questions as well. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Jacobs to close us out here. And again, thank you, Dr. Ray, for a very, very inspiring presentation.
Thank you all for having me.
Thank you both. Really wonderful presentations, and thank you, Heather, for the moderation. The next webinar will be also on the theme of sociology, this one on environmental sociology with Dr. Ray's colleague at the University of Maryland, College Park, Dana Fisher, also a well-regarded, well-known sociologist with an emphasis on environmental sociology. She's also a contributor to the work on a Sociology Experiment and contributing the environmental sociology chapter there. So look forward to that webinar. That's on March 10th. And yeah, until then, thank you very much for attending. And thank you again, Dr. Ray, Dr. Parker. And
Thank you. Dana's amazing. Come back and listen to her.
Thank you. We look forward to seeing you all on March 10th.